Morning.
Well, good morning, media colleagues, and welcome to the Ronald Reagan Building, home of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. This is the first press briefing we've had in person in quite some time, and we're very pleased to have you here with us today. The topic of today's press briefing is an aspect of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's mission that many Americans may be unfamiliar with. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, an agency within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, has a unique statutory authority to prevent goods made by forced labor from entering the United States. In a few moments, the Honorable Alejandro Mayorkas, the United States Secretary of Homeland Security, will take the stage and share more information about that authority, and he will also announce a new DHS action to combat forced labor in U.S. supply chains. The Acting Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Mr. Troy Miller, will subsequently discuss how and why DHS is taking that action, as well as review the responsibilities of the trade community and explain the actions that consumers can take to support the fight against forced labor. Before we begin, however, I would like to take this opportunity briefly to introduce two additional officials from U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Office of Trade. First, I would like to congratulate the new Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Trade, Ms. Anne Marie Highsmith. And second, I would like to recognize Ms. Ana Hinojosa, the Executive Director for Trade Remedy Law Enforcement within the Office of Trade. Ms. Hinojosa leads CBP's multidisciplinary forced labor enforcement team. Finally, I would like to thank members of the National Security Council, the Department of Homeland Security, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection who are in the audience today, without whose efforts this press briefing would not have been possible. A final note, I will remind you that the topic of this press briefing is forced labor enforcement. We will have limited time for the question and answer period following the remarks, and so I would ask you to be polite and keep the comments to your comments and questions to the topic of forced labor enforcement. It is now my privilege to introduce Mr. Alejandro Mayorkas, Secretary of Homeland Security. Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we are announcing an important update regarding our efforts to prevent goods produced with forced labor from entering the United States. It is part of our continued commitment to protect human rights and international labor standards and promote a more fair and competitive global marketplace by fulfilling the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to ending forced labor. During the 47th G7 summit this month, the United States and G7 countries committed to removing forced labor from global supply chains, and today's action is the latest in a series of actions that the United States has taken to address forced labor and other human rights abuses against the Uyghur people and other ethnic and religious minorities in China's Xinjiang province. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has issued a withhold release order on silica-based products made by the Chinese firm Hoshine Silicon Industry Company Limited and its subsidiaries. Silica is a raw material that is used to make components for solar panels, electronics, and other goods. This order was issued because CBP has information reasonably indicating that Hoshine uses forced labor to produce its silica-based products. Effective immediately, CBP personnel at all U.S. ports of entry will detain shipments that contain silica-based products made wholly or in part by Hoshine. Hoshine operates in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and DHS is deeply concerned by credible and growing reports of China's state-sponsored use of forced labor and other human rights violations in the Xinjiang region. Chinese companies are profiting from these abuses. Companies like Hoshine, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, Huifei Bidland, Xinjiang Yungar Cotton and Linen Company Limited, and others are attempting to sell cheaply made goods to consumers in the United States and in other countries. That is unfair to law-abiding businesses that respect international labor standards. It is also unfair to consumers who may unwittingly purchase goods made in conditions of modern-day slavery. DHS is leading the charge against forced labor. Since Congress passed the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, CBP has developed a world-class civil investigative program to identify and prevent goods made by forced labor from entering the United States. Since 2016, CBP has issued more than 30 withhold release orders, including a record-breaking 13 in fiscal year 2020. 8 of those 13 withhold release orders were on goods from China, including apparel, computer parts, and hair products. This fiscal year, CBP has issued 4 withhold release orders on goods from China, including 1 on all cotton products and tomato products from the Xinjiang region. These withhold release orders have practical consequences for producers and U.S. importers. Since October 2020, CBP has targeted more than 1,200 U.S.-bound shipments that contained more than $400 million of goods suspected to be made by forced labor. CBP detained nearly $275 million of those goods in the 674 shipments that applied for entry and deterred the remainder of the targeted shipments from entering the United States. Those goods might otherwise have ended up in the United States food supply, in American households, and even on the backs of American consumers. Finally, I would like to recognize the phenomenal work that CBP's public servants have done to enhance the agency's forced labor enforcement capabilities. CBP has developed a civil investigative program for forced labor that is world-class. We are grateful to receive additional appropriations from Congress this fiscal year to help ensure that this team can properly execute its vital mission. As President Biden made clear at the recent G7 summit, the United States will not tolerate modern-day slavery in our supply chains. This withhold release order will ensure we continue to protect human rights and international labor standards, promote a fair and more competitive global marketplace, and reinforce this administration's commitment to deploy a whole-of-government approach to eradicating forced labor. DHS and CBP continue to aggressively investigate the use of forced labor in silica supply chains and in a broad range of other industries. Producers and U.S. importers alike should understand that there will be consequences for entities that attempt to exploit forced labor to sell goods in the United States. If goods are subject to withhold release order, CBP will detain them at ports of entry. If goods are subject to a forced labor finding, CBP will seize the merchandise upon arrival at ports of entry. In either case, there are significant financial costs to the importer. Those financial costs can go beyond the costs of delays at the port or the loss of merchandise. For example, after CBP issued a forced labor finding against the Malaysian company Top Glove, the world's largest producer of disposable gloves, the company's listing on the Hong Kong Stock Index was delayed and its share price declined significantly. But that's not all. CBP can also impose monetary penalties on entities that import goods in violation of forced labor. I will now turn to Acting Commissioner Troy Miller, who will share additional details about CBP's investigation into Hoshine. Anna Hinojosa and Anne-Marie Highsmith, who were introduced earlier, deserve special recognition for your extraordinary work and the leadership of your extraordinary teams in partnership, of course, with our colleagues at the National Security Council. Commissioner.
Thank you, sir. Again, welcome everybody, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Today's withhold release order is a result of CBP's investigation into Hoshine Industries' production processes. During the investigation, CBP obtained information reasonably indicating that Hoshine uses forced labor in its production process. Pursuant to Section 1307 of the Tariff Act, I have instructed CBP personnel at all U.S. ports of entry to detain shipments that contain silica-based products made by Hoshine and its subsidiaries. In addition, I have instructed CBP personnel to detain shipments that contain polysilicon or other materials that are derived from or produced using Hoshine's silica-based products. These instructions are effective immediately. Before I get into the mechanics of this investigation, I want to make two things clear. First, CBP has longstanding authorities under federal law to investigate and prevent goods made by forced labor from entering the United States. CBP adheres closely to its statutory authorities when taking forced labor enforcement actions. Second, CBP's forced labor investigations are guided by the International Labor Organization's indicators of forced labor. In this case, CBP identified two indicators of forced labor. The first was intimidation and threats, and the second was restriction of movement. During forced labor investigations, CBP evaluates a wide range of source material, including government reports, studies by non-governmental organizations, investigative reporting, and first-hand accounts. When CBP has information reasonably indicating that the use of forced labor has produced goods to U.S. supply chains, the agency will issue a withhold release order. Withhold release orders instruct CBP personnel at ports of entry to detain shipments containing goods subject to the order and to ask additional questions about how those goods were produced. Under U.S. law, importers have 3 months to take one of two actions. First, the importer may submit proof that the goods were not imported in violation of Section 1307 of the Tariff Act. Second, the importer may re-export the goods. If the importer does neither, then CBP will exclude the goods. If the importer does not export the excluded goods within 60 days, then CBP will consider the goods abandoned and will take steps to destroy the shipments. I have instructed CBP personnel to follow these procedures when they encounter shipments that contain silica-based products made wholly or in part by Hoshine. CBP is proud to be a global leader in the fight against forced labor in U.S. supply chains. This is the third withhold release order that CBP has issued this fiscal year on goods made by forced labor in China's Xinjiang region. The Xinjiang region continues to be an area of high risk for forced labor. Last year, CBP issued 13 withhold release orders. 8 of those withhold release orders were on goods made by forced labor in China. CBP routinely works in close partnership with the trade community, and we'd like to remind our partners the importance of knowing their supply chains. Under U.S. law, importers are required to exercise reasonable care to ensure that the supply chain are free of forced labor. The U.S. government provides ample information to help the trade community understand the risks of forced labor in global supply chains. Last summer, DHS, with the Department of Commerce, Labor, and State, issued the Xinjiang Business Advisory. The advisory warns the trade community of the reputational, legal, and economic consequence of doing business with entities in the Xinjiang region that use forced labor. In addition, companies should review the Department of Labor's Comply Chain app, the Department of Labor's list of goods made by child labor or forced labor, the Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report, and the Department of State's country reports on human rights practices. The trade community should also continue to closely follow news reports. Members of the press and experts at non-governmental organizations continue to produce detailed reports of forced labor in Xinjiang and other areas of the world. Thanks in large part to their efforts, companies can no longer claim ignorance for an exercise for overlooking forced labor in their supply chains. The public should also be aware of their responsibilities as consumers. First, shop directly with reputable retailers. Before making a purchase, visit the websites of our favorite companies and verify that they have fair trade policies and corporate responsibility programs. Second, learn about the industries and regions that are of high risk for forced labor. Read the news and review the withhold release orders at cbp.gov, the Department of Labor's list of goods report, and the Department of State's trafficking in persons report. Third, report violations. Anyone can report allegations of forced labor in the U.S. supply chain via eallegations.cbp.gov or by calling 1-800-BE-ALERT. More importantly, consumers can help raise awareness of forced labor and its human and economic consequence. Talk to your family, friends, and neighbors about where the goods you buy come from. Use your social media accounts to share the work that the U.S. government, non-governmental organizations, and the media are doing to expose forced labor. Use your voice to tell companies that we will not tolerate forced labor in U.S. supply chains. I want to end by thanking the international trade specialists, officers, and mission support staff at CBP who work tirelessly on this issue. Your work helps protect millions of vulnerable workers and helps create a level playing field for law-abiding businesses around the globe. Anne-Marie, Anna, thank you for your leadership. Forced labor is a form of modern-day slavery and subjects millions of people around the world to horrific abuses. The use of forced labor violates international labor laws and fundamental human rights while introducing unfair competition in the global marketplace. Another plug here for Executive Director Anna Hinojosa, Deputy Executive Director Eric Choi, and the Forced Labor Enforcement Team. This incredible team was recently selected as a finalist for the 2021 Service to America's Medal for Safety, Security, and International Affairs. Thanks to your support, the team also advanced to the final round of voting for the Sammy's People Choice Award. Please keep voting daily for the CBP team to support efforts to end forced labor. CBP will continue to aggressively investigate and prevent goods made by forced labor from entering the U.S. economy. CBP will continue to share the best practices and lessons we have learned from our forced labor enforcement efforts with like-minded partners, and CBP will continue to encourage all other countries to join the fight against forced labor. Thank you once again for joining this brief and for your continued interest in CBP's mission. The Secretary and I look forward to your questions, sir.
We'll open it up.
We'll open up the media press briefing now to the Q&A, and we'll take questions, and we'll start in the front row there with Mr. Fox from AP.
Hi. Can you specifically say what the import records show for this company, Hoshine, in recent years in dollar terms? And then also, is the administration or DHS seeking any kind of additional authorities in terms of enforcing or expanding its enforcement actions with WROs going forward?
Let me answer the second part of the question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the subject matter experts for your first for the first part of your question. Right now, what we are focused upon is making sure that the existing authorities that we have are used to the fullest to address the infection of forced labor into our marketplace. And I should emphasize something with respect to forced labor, that of course it has economic consequences, it has economic aspects to it, but fundamentally and primarily it is a human rights issue. It is about the treatment and care of individuals, respecting their dignity and not divesting them of their rights and their humanity to achieve unfair economic advantage. I'll turn it over to Anna or Anne-Marie for the...
Can you hear me okay from here? With regards to the volume of importations coming into the United States from Hoshine and its subsidiaries, there are different levels of volume. Some of them are related to direct importations from Hoshine and its subsidiaries, and others are downstream products that we've identified that contain products produced in whole or in part with Hoshine silica-based products. The numbers are not totally, they're an evolving number as we continue to investigate, but roughly over the last 2.5 years, we've had somewhere around $6 million worth of imports, of direct imports from Hoshine. And over the last, again, same period of time, an estimate of over $150 million of imports of downstream products. There are certainly more products that are produced, but we are continuing our review of the connections between importers and end products to determine what additional targeting we need to incorporate.
We'll take our next question from Mr. Alim Saitov from Radio Free Asia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Secretary. My first question is, in last February, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute issued a big report called Uyghurs for Sale. In the report, they stated that from 2017 to 2019, the Chinese government forcibly transferred 80,000 plus Uyghurs to 9 Chinese provinces, and there are 27 different factories in the rest of China. It's not located in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And also more than 82 global brands, including Apple, Nike, Amazon, GM, HP, all of them are implicated one way or another. So my first question is the CBP planning to issue a withhold release order on the products made by the Uyghur forced labor in companies in the rest of China, not just in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region? And also the second one is, beside the business advisor issued last year to American companies that advising them be careful with the potential implication of the Uyghur forced labor, what other measures are you planning to take to prevent American companies from using Uyghur forced labor?
So let me say the following, if I may. First, we're not in a position, of course, to answer questions about ongoing investigations or where our investigations may lead, number one. Number two, and fundamentally and quite critically, we're going to root out forced labor wherever it exists. And three, we're working very closely with the private sector. It's a public-private partnership to achieve a shared objective, a shared goal, and a shared imperative of rooting out forced labor wherever it might exist.
We'll take our next question from Ms. Whalen at Washington Post.
Hi there. Does the WRO apply to any solar panel made from Hoshine raw materials? And if so, do you know roughly what percentage of U.S. solar panel imports that will affect? I assume it'll be quite large, right?
So the answer is yes. The withhold release order would include any products that are built in whole or in part with silica-based products made by Hoshine or its subsidiaries. Our initial assessment is that there has been some movement away from this particular manufacturer. So in looking at our the number of importations of goods coming in connected to Hoshine, they seem to have declined somewhat in the last year. We don't have an exact number to share with you today.
And of course, we are focused on solar panels because of their advantages with respect to environmental impacts. But, and this is very important, we're going to root out forced labor wherever it exists, and we'll look for alternative products to achieve the environmental impacts that are a critical goal of this administration.
We'll take our next question from Paul Hanley at AFP.
Have you had any reactions from the Chinese on this series of WRO since last year? Do you see any modification of behavior or evasive behavior? Any kind of reaction?
Our approach is as follows. We're going to take the enforcement actions that we need to take. We are hopeful that the enforcement actions that we take deter any perpetuation of this heinous activity. And if it doesn't, we'll address it in another fora as well.
Take our next question from Dave Lauder at Reuters.
Hi, David Lauder with Reuters. Just wondering what are the prospects for this WRO to be expanded to a region-wide WRO? You started out with the cotton ban, was started out with a few entities and then expanded to XPCC and then region-wide. Is this where this is headed? And what are the implications for the Biden administration's energy goals here? Because Xinjiang produces like 45% of the world's polysilicon.
So the environmental goals are a priority for this administration. Our environmental goals will not be achieved on the backs of human beings in a forced labor environment. We're going to root out forced labor, and we're going to use alternative products that are manufactured and produced legitimately in keeping with our values and our commitment to a fair marketplace. I'll turn to Anna if I misspeak, but a regional approach. This is not necessarily calibrated to geography, but rather calibrated to conduct. And we're very mindful of the fact that we've seen a lot of this conduct, illegal conduct, in a particular region that may drive our investigative efforts, but it's not geographically determined. It's determined according to the conduct of particular companies. Anna, do you want to add anything?
I would just say that at this point we're not able to discuss any ongoing investigations. We certainly will continue to investigate allegations of forced labor, in particular in this particular industry, but we're not in a position to indicate that this would stay as a regional area. As indicated by the Secretary, these products don't always stay within that region, and so the regional umbrella isn't necessarily applicable. We are looking entity specific in most cases, and only if we're able to substantiate that the issue involves all manufacturing of those products within the region would we then look to expand to that. At this point, we can't comment on where the investigations are going.
I want to add something too, if I may. Thank you, and this point is very important. We're going to root out forced labor wherever it exists. It tragically does not necessarily have geographic boundaries. I remember when I was a federal prosecutor in California, we prosecuted a forced labor case in Los Angeles, California. So we're going to find it and we're going to root it out wherever it might occur.
We'll take our next question from Yuka Hayashi from Wall Street Journal.
Your team is doing a lot more with the new WROs and a lot more detentions. What are you doing to cope with the increased workload in terms of the number of staffers beefing up the enforcement process?
I would just say thank you, as the Secretary mentioned, thank you to Congress for allocating additional funds this year. So we are continue to beef up our forced labor team, and you're seeing the results of that.
And we'd like to take a question from the conference line. Moderator, could we open the conference line to a question, please?
Yes, absolutely. If you wish to ask a question, please press 1, then 0. You may remove yourself from queue at any time by pressing 1, 0 again. If you are using a speakerphone, please pick up your handset before pressing the numbers, and please also limit yourself to one question. We'll take our first question from Manik Mehta with International Syndicated Journalists. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. I have a question in regard to raw materials produced in Xinjiang exported to third countries, which in turn process the raw materials and produce finished products. An example would be cotton produced in Xinjiang and shipped to neighboring countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, or even Pakistan, which supply garments to the U.S. How do you propose to verify and control such products from entering the U.S. market? Thanks very much.
Go ahead and take that question. Clearly, this polysilicon and any silicon products in the manufacture of goods is huge. And what we're doing is we're focusing on where we're identifying the highest risk of shipments actually being produced in whole or in part with forced labor. We obviously have the direct shipments coming from those manufacturers. We've identified subsequent downstream products, and we will continue to search to make further connections of downstream manufacturers containing these products. These do not have to be coming out of China, nor do they have to be coming out of the Xinjiang region, but we are very focused in making sure that we have we're trying to be very responsible in ensuring that we don't unintentionally stop legitimate trade that we don't have a clear connection to those raw materials. So it is always a dynamic process, and we continue even after withhold release order is issued to refine our targeting and refine our information so that we focus on those shipments again that are highest risk of containing goods produced in whole or in part with those products reasonably believed to be made with forced labor.
Thank you, colleagues. That's all the time we have today. I will let the Secretary close us out, and we appreciate you joining us.
No, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to commend, again, our experts and our incredibly dedicated public servants for this impactful work. Thank you all so very much.
Do you have any comment on Mr. Scott stepping down?
I'll take that. As I think you're very well aware, we don't comment on internal personnel decisions. I will tell you that we are incredibly grateful for Chief Scott's dedicated service for so many years to the Border Patrol. We are also incredibly excited about Chief Ortiz's future in leading the Border Patrol. He's been in the Border Patrol for more than 20 years. He's the Deputy Chief at current.
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time that we have.
Have you been briefed on the situation in Surfside